So we keep talking about ecology, and we've covered what populations do. We've covered community level processes. Now we're going to kind of step back and look at ecosystem-wide processes. And the first one I want to talk about is transfer of energy and biomass. Energy is, of course, metabolic energy, the chemical energy that you use to run all of that complex chemistry that powers you. Biomass is our word for any living matter, and organisms either produce biomass, in which case we call them producers. In land ecosystems, that's typically plants, although of course there's algae and bacteria that can do it as well. Or there's organisms that consume biomass. Typically in the ecosystems you're familiar with, that would be animals, although there's protists and things that can do that as well. So here we've got a consumer munching on some producers. And when this consumer eats, both biomass and energy are transferred from the food to the eater. You get your biomass, all of the stuff that makes up your body came from the food that you eat. So does all of the energy that you use to make that biomass live. So biomass and energy go together in a sense, because you gain energy by metabolizing the biomass that you eat. Right. So we can talk about how biomass and energy flow through an ecosystem as each critter eats other critters and gets eaten by still others. Every time a bug eats a plant, or a bird eats the bug, or the barred owls in my yard eat the small birds, biomass and energy get transferred. And we often talk about biomass and energy transfer as taking place between what we call trophic levels. So if you take all of the organisms in an ecosystem, like everything living in any ecosystem, say it's the UCA Nature Reserve, or hell, your front lawn, we can divide them into primary producers, which is all the organisms that generate biomass and the energy that goes with it. Almost always, I can think of some weird exceptions, but almost always that's done by photosynthesis, and we're talking about plants. And of course, algae and certain bacteria and other critters that carry out photosynthesis. Those would be your primary producers. Primary consumers are whatever feeds on the producers. So if grass is your primary producers, a cow might be the primary consumer. Or for that matter, grasshoppers eating the grass could be the primary consumers. Secondary consumers eat the primary consumers. So a bird eating a grasshopper that was eating the grass would be your secondary consumers. Tertiary consumers eat the secondary consumers, and quaternary consumers eat the tertiary consumers. So we can talk about producers and then multiple levels of consumers. I'm simplifying this a little bit because many organisms occupy several levels at once. If you eat these delicious steak fajitas, you are a primary consumer because you're eating plants, peppers and the corn used to make the tortillas, or the wheat, I guess. You're also a secondary consumer because you're eating cow, which is a primary consumer. So, in any given meal, you might be eating on more than one trophic level. Certainly this is true for bears, come to mind, that'll happily be primary consumers when they're eating berries, and secondary consumers when they're scavenging meat or eating bee larvae or something like that. Pigs as well can eat on multiple levels. And also I listed 5 trophic levels, but there's no particular reason why there only have to be 5. There are some ecosystems with many fewer trophic levels than this. In the oceans, which I'm most familiar with, in some areas you'd find only 2. And some ecosystems might have more. In other parts of the ocean, there could be as many as 9. There's no special reason why there have to be 1 level of producers and 4 of consumers. It could be more or less depending on where you are. But if you look at this diagram on the left-hand side, this would be fairly typical for North American prairie. Your plants are the primary producers. Here, I'm going to go ahead and deface that. So your plants right here would be primary producers. The grasshoppers that eat the plants would be your primary consumers. We also call those herbivores, meaning that they are plant eaters. This mouse eating a grasshopper might be a secondary consumer. We call it a carnivore because it's eating meat. A tertiary consumer might be the rattlesnake eating the mouse, and your quaternary consumer might be the red-tailed hawk that's eating the rattlesnake. Over in the open ocean, the primary producers are what we call phytoplankton. Plankton doesn't necessarily mean the owner of the Krusty Krab. Plankton is any organism that floats but can't control its own position by swimming. Phytoplankton would be photosynthetic bacteria and photosynthetic protists. In a lake, it would be the stuff that makes the water green and hazy on a bright summer day. So in the ocean, the phytoplankton would be the primary producers. The zooplankton, which means little larval fish and certain protists and little shrimp relatives, similar to the Daphnia that you got to play with in one of your labs, I think, those water fleas that you were dosing with alcohol. Those would be the primary consumers. Those get eaten by small fish. Those get eaten by bigger fish. And then the really big fish might get eaten by orcas, which would be your secondary, tertiary, and quaternary consumers. The highest level consumers are sometimes called apex predators. They eat other critters, but nobody eats them. Nobody preys on killer whales, except for people who catch them and put them in SeaWorld. But yeah, killer whales have no natural enemies. Nobody eats them. Now imagine you could measure the biomass in an ecosystem, and we have ways of estimating this. Let's say you took an area of, what the heck, the prairie in the nature reserve, and you uprooted all of the plants, every last one, and you weighed it. You could estimate the biomass of the primary producers of the prairie. And then imagine you could vacuum all of the plant-eating insects out and weigh them. You could measure the biomass of the primary consumers and so on. Imagine you measured the biomass at each one of these trophic levels and you represented it as a bar, stack the bars on top of each other, and you get a diagram called a trophic pyramid. Trophic is the Greek root meaning to feed. So the trophic pyramid is the pyramid of feeding. And it's interesting why it's a pyramid. You always have the bar, every bar is shorter than the bar below it. So you always get a pyramid shaped diagram where the base is always wider and it gets narrower as you go towards the top. What this means is the higher you go in that food chain, the higher you go in that trophic chain, the less biomass there is. Our prairie might have, I don't really know, I'm going to kind of spitball it, maybe 10,000 pounds of plants, which might feed 1,000 pounds of insects, which might feed 100 pounds of little rodents, which might feed 10 pounds worth of snakes, which might feed a 1 pound hawk, or something like that. The biomass gets less the higher up you go. And the reason for that is that you lose energy and biomass at transitions between levels. Most of the food that you eat does not go into building new biomass, which is a good thing, or else you'd gain roughly 3 pounds a day. But most of what you eat doesn't go into making more you. That's partly because your metabolism is not 100% efficient. You can't get 100% of the biomass and energy that's present in your food. There's no process like this that's absolutely 100% efficient. Yours is something like 30%. And then some of your biomass you don't digest, like dietary fiber. Your body can't break that stuff down, and it's lost as waste. And then a lot of the energy you get from your food, in your case, it goes to heating your body, which means it ultimately radiates out into space. Or it's used, instead of for making new you, it's used just to kind of maintain things. So every time you have biomass going from one level to another, most of it gets lost. We call the proportion of biomass at a lower level that ends up in a higher level as the ecological efficiency, and the average is about 10%. In real life, it can vary quite a bit, but 10% is a decent rule of thumb. So every one of those bars is only about 10% the width of the bar below it. You know, as I've said, 10,000 pounds of plants will support roughly 1,000 pounds of insects, which will support roughly 100 pounds of mice, which might support 10 pounds of snakes, which might support 1 pound of red-tailed hawk, let's say. So biomass and energy is lost at every step in the food web. Here's a pyramid for an ocean ecosystem. In a region of the open ocean, you might have 1 million kilograms of little plants, you know, little photosynthetic protists and bacteria and all that. They might support 100,000 pounds of little shrimpies. And those might support 10,000 pounds of shrimp and maybe small fish. And those might support 1,000 kilograms of larger fish, which might be enough to support 100 kilogram shark. And again, when we measure this in the real world, it varies a bit, but 10% is a decent rule of thumb for ecological efficiency. This leads to some important consequences. When organisms feed, they may take certain substances in their bodies that they can't easily break down or excrete, and those tend to build up over time in the body. One of them is a famous insecticide called DDT. Your grandparents might be able to remember when DDT was routinely just sprayed all over neighborhoods in the summer to get the mosquito population down. DDT was used a lot in agriculture. It was finally banned in, I believe, 1971. One of the reasons why was that insects were building up immunity to it because of our old friend natural selection. because the most resistant insects were the ones that were surviving and breeding. So DDT was becoming less and less useful. The other reason is this. DDT that's sprayed on crops ends up eventually washing off the fields and making its way, trickling into the nearest water, into your local ditches, and then on into lakes and rivers. The concentration of DDT in water was typically 0.000003 parts per million. That's not a lot. Percent would be parts per 100. So there's what? 1/10,000th of a percent is a part per million. Sorry, just checking something on the chat rather. And so this would be something like 1/3 millionth of 1/10,000th of a percent. It's not much. Here's the thing, the little phytoplankton, the little photosynthetic algae and bacteria, the green pond scum living in the lake, were taking up DDT. And then every one of those little zooplankton, the little daphnias and other little shrimpy things in the lake, every one of those is having to eat thousands of phytoplankton just to stay alive. And every time they eat a phytoplankton, they would take DDT into their bodies. And the thing about DDT is that you can't break it down and you can't get rid of it. Once you have it in your body, you're pretty much stuck with it. And so because every little shrimpy is eating many thousands of little green scum algae, the zooplankton were building up a dose of about 0.04 parts per million because every single zooplankton eats thousands of little algae. Every little fish is eating hundreds of little shrimpies. So the DDT dose in the small fish was 1/2 of a part per million. Every large fish is eating small fish. So the dose there is 2 parts per million. And then fish-eating birds like the osprey and most notably the bald eagle, which is our national symbol and which likes to nest on trees close to lakes and eats a lot of fish. The DDT concentration there was 25 parts per million. And so the concentration of DDT went up by a factor of 10 million times. DDT doesn't poison bald eagles themselves, but it messes with their ability to create eggshells. It screws up their ability to use calcium. So bald eagles that were full of DDT were either unable to lay eggs, or if they laid them, the eggs had such delicate shells that they'd shatter. They'd shatter, right as they were coming out of mommy, or they'd shatter when she tried to sit on them. This is the reason why the bald eagle at its lowest, I looked this up this morning, there were only about 400 pairs of bald eagles left in the 48 contiguous United States. The only place where they weren't in danger was Alaska. Since we have banned DDT, bald eagles are starting to come back. They're now no longer on the endangered species list. At least some years they'll nest in some of the trees around Lake Conway. So you can see them close to home now. And that's what we call biological magnification. Whenever you have a toxin that organisms can't either break down or poop out, the concentration of it goes up the higher you go on that trophic pyramid. Another example, mercury. Mercury is not really good for you. There are mercury compounds that are deadly. There is some mercury that occurs naturally in the oceans, but mercury can also be added as an industrial pollutant or something that comes from burning coal. Mercury can be present in the ash and eventually end up in the oceans. The US government currently advises women, if they're pregnant or nursing, not to eat shark or swordfish and limit the amount of tuna that they eat. That's a tuna, by the way. And the reason is the ocean may have only the tiniest amount of mercury in it, but every little phytoplankton will take on just a tiny concentration of mercury, but every little shrimp will eat thousands of little algae, and every small fish will eat hundreds of little shrimp, and every big fish will eat dozens of little fish, and every tuna will eat dozens of bigger fish. And every time you go up in concentration, every time you go up the trophic pyramid, the concentration of mercury goes up. So the fish that are likeliest to contain dangerous levels of mercury are the apex predators: shark, swordfish, and tuna, which are major predators in the open ocean. If you've only seen tuna in little cans, you may not realize just how big the suckers get. And mercury is most dangerous to developing fetuses and newborns, which is why those regulations are in place. It's not quite as dangerous if you're not pregnant, but if you're pregnant or nursing, it could potentially have bad effects on the baby. Okay, so I've talked about producers and consumers, but I've left out an important part. That's not the end of the story. Here are some decomposers. These are fungi growing on a tree stump. There's lots of these in the nature reserve or just about anywhere that you have, dead wood that's been left out for a while. Most of the fungus, remember, is growing as that network of filaments. It's growing as a mycelium. You might remember that word from the early days, growing through the wood and slowly, slowly breaking it down. The parts that you see, these fan-shaped things growing out of the wood, that's just the reproductive structures. But most of the fungus is inside the wood and slowly breaking it down, making it, making it into rotten wood, crumbly and, easy to break apart with your fingers and all of that. Given enough time, these fungi will break down that stump completely, and it will just crumble and eventually become part of the soil. And given enough time, even the little crumbs will be broken down, and there won't be any physical trace of that tree left. So decomposers are the ultimate recyclers because many bacteria, most fungi, getting an assist from animals like termites and things like that, they'll break down dead organisms, and ultimately the atoms that made up those organisms get recycled. Given enough time, the carbon that was in this tree stump will end up part of maybe a new tree. And that's my lead in into cycling in ecosystems, because when you look at an ecosystem, things tend to go round in circles. There's several of these cycles, and I may not get to all of them today, but the one I want to focus on right now is the carbon cycle, which you can look at as taking place in an ecosystem or even at a wider scale on a global scale. This is the kind of thing that affects the entire biosphere. What drives the carbon cycle is photosynthesis, right? This chemical magic done by plants and algae and things like that, that harvest light energy and uses it to take carbon dioxide right out of the atmosphere. CO2, one carbon atom stuck to two oxygens. Plants grab that right out of the air and use it to build more complex molecules. They can build molecules of a sugar called glucose, and then use that glucose to build even more complex molecules. And they can make all of the biomass that they're going to make just from CO2, water, and some nutrients coming from the soil. By the way, we call this carbon fixation. If you're fixing carbon, you're taking carbon in a form that most organisms can't use and chemically combining it to make a form that they can. So converting carbon dioxide into sugars and then starches and cellulose and then other things, that's carbon fixation. That drives the carbon cycle. The other thing that drives it is respiration, which just refers to taking biomass, breaking it down, extracting energy from it, and giving off a waste product, which happens to be carbon dioxide. When you eat a hamburger, right, some of that hamburger will end up as biomass in you. Some of it gets excreted out. A lot of it will be broken down by your cells to extract energy in the form of this stuff we talked about earlier called ATP. And the eventual waste product of that ATP extraction process is carbon dioxide gas. Your cells produce carbon dioxide, your blood carries that to your lungs, and then that's the waste product that you breathe out. So respiration of consumers and decomposers, because fungi do this too, even though they don't have lungs and they don't breathe, they give off carbon dioxide, and that puts carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So plants suck down carbon dioxide and make biomass. You eat biomass, and your waste product is carbon dioxide. So the whole thing runs in a great cycle because what each one needs is a waste product to the other. Wow, this is where you're all supposed to go, whoa, cool. It can be more complex than that. There's loops within the cycle. Fire puts carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So if you burn wood, you're taking the complex molecules that were made by photosynthesis and converting them back into carbon dioxide and putting that into the atmosphere. Volcanoes put carbon dioxide in, and there are natural processes that remove carbon dioxide. One is, I'm not going to go into this, but certain minerals, certain components of rocks will combine with carbon dioxide as part of the weathering process, the process of slow chemical breakdown and crumbling that you see everywhere you've got rock exposed to the air. So there are processes that are not necessarily living that can add and also take out carbon dioxide. Since I've mentioned carbon dioxide, I want to add something about what's called the greenhouse effect. Think about this. The sun shines on the Earth. Most of the energy that hits the Earth goes right through the atmosphere. If it didn't, the atmosphere would be opaque and we wouldn't be able to see anything. But the reason you can see the sun is that most of the light and other forms of energy that are coming from the sun pass right through the atmosphere and hit your eyes. Hopefully not too much or you'll burn a hole in your retina. But that's the ultimate source of the light on the surface of the Earth. It's sunlight going right through the atmosphere. One exception I'll mention just briefly is that between 12 and 19 miles above the surface, there's a layer of a type of oxygen called ozone, chemical formula O3. Ozone is considered a pollutant if you get it on the surface of the Earth. Ozone's responsible for that kind of tangy metallic smell you can smell if you've ever been around high voltage electrical equipment. That's ozone, and it's not real good for you. But when it's way above the Earth's surface, 12 to 19 miles above, it's very important because it absorbs over 97% of medium frequency ultraviolet radiation. Since ultraviolet radiation damages DNA, it's a good thing we have ozone up there because that filters out some of the most harmful forms of radiation that the sun produces. And that layer heats up as it absorbs ultraviolet. Longer wavelength UV does reach the surface. That's the type of ultraviolet light that if it hits your skin, it will cause you to tan or burn if you don't tan very well. Too much exposure to long wavelength ultraviolet light will cause you skin damage and potentially cancer. That's why you want to wear sunscreen and make sure you don't spend too long in the tanning bed if you're into doing that. Right. But most of the energy from the sun goes right through the atmosphere, hits the solid earth, and hits the water of the earth, and those heat up. The energy is not lost. It can't go anywhere. Basic physics says energy can't be created or destroyed. What happens is that it gets hot. That energy that was in the light and ultraviolet radiation and other things, that energy coming from the sun has to go somewhere. And what it does is causes the earth to heat up. If you have ever walked across a parking lot barefoot on a summer day, you will know that the solid earth can heat up quite a bit. Used to do that when I was a kid and we'd go swimming. Maybe some of you have similar experiences, like, ow. Anyway, as the earth warms up, it starts giving off energy because anything that's warm radiates energy away from it. You're giving off energy right now, believe it or not. And the atmosphere is good at soaking up that longer wavelength radiation that the earth gives off. In particular, the gases in the atmosphere, water vapor, carbon dioxide, and methane, or natural gas, CH4. You can see the effects of the earth being warmed by the sun and then warming the atmosphere if you've ever seen birds soaring in a thermal. A thermal's an area where the warm earth heats the air and causes the air to rise. And soaring birds, like around here, turkey vultures, can actually find those zones of rising air and increase their altitude without flapping their wings, just by riding the upward current of air. So if you've ever seen vultures circling, assuming they're not getting ready to land and eat some poor dead thing, they're taking advantage of this rising air column. And that's a way in which you can see the warm earth heating the atmosphere and causing that mass of air to rise. And the vultures rise along with it. So the atmosphere gets warmed by the earth because the atmosphere acts kind of like a blanket that tends to trap heat close to the surface, right? A blanket, unless it's an electric blanket, doesn't really warm you. What it does is take your body's heat and hold it close to your body instead of letting it radiate out into space. That's how warm, fuzzy blankets keep you warm. They trap and reflect your own body heat to you. So what warms the earth is both the sun and warmth coming from the warmed atmosphere. It's called re-radiation. One of these places where the little curly red arrows go up, hit a gas molecule, and then go back down. You're looking at a diagram of re-radiation, the warm atmosphere reheating the earth. And carbon dioxide is very good at doing this, at absorbing radiant energy from the earth and re-radiating it back to the earth. And this is the not perfectly accurately named greenhouse effect. Actual greenhouses don't quite work this way, but we're probably stuck with the name greenhouse effect for now. For the record, this was worked out in 1896 by a guy named Svante Arrhenius. This is he, a Nobel Prize winning chemist from Sweden. who incidentally also developed the concept of activation energy, which you ought to remember from our lectures on enzymes. So the basics of how the greenhouse effect works have been understood for over 120 years. You get a lot of politics mixing with this, but one thing I can assure you of is this is not something that the Chinese made up to destroy US industry. We've known the basics of how this works for well over a century now. Okay, 1958, a fellow by the name of Charles Keeling sets up a base on the largest island in the state of Hawaii. The large island is also called Hawaii, but it's usually just called the Big Island. And he sets it up on one of the great volcanic mountains up there called Mauna Loa, over 13,000 feet. That's 4,000 meters or so. And he starts measuring how much carbon dioxide gas is in the atmosphere, because it's not polluted, it's not downwind from any source of pollution, and it's pretty well mixed. If you want to estimate what's going on in the entire atmosphere, or at least the northern hemisphere, Mauna Loa is a good place to measure it. And it turns out there's an annual cycle of carbon dioxide levels. Starting in spring, so starting in March, well, it really starts up here in, I guess that's May. May's when in the northern hemisphere, the cold temperatures are completely done, and the enormous millions of square kilometers of forest that we have in Canada and Alaska and the northern United States and Europe and Siberia, there's just miles upon miles of solid forest. Those plants all put out leaves and they come to life and they carry out photosynthesis. And between May and September, they're so active that they actually suck down a measurable amount of carbon dioxide in the world's atmosphere. That's this downward part of the curve. That's the part where all of those endless forests are photosynthetically active and they slurp down CO2 globally. However, growth stops in the fall, and occasional wildfires, but also the decay of dead plants ends up returning most of that CO2 back to the atmosphere. And that's why we have this upward part of the curve. That's the part where photosynthesis has slowed down because of the northern winter, and respiration dominates and puts that CO2 back. So you can actually track the carbon cycle that way, like the breathing of an enormous set of lungs. Incidentally, because we have a couple of students from the Southern Hemisphere, I should mention that the Northern Hemisphere dominates just because the Northern Hemisphere happens to have more land. The Northern Hemisphere is half the globe, but about 2/3 of the land area. And the Southern Hemisphere not only has less land, it's got less land that's suitable for developing enormous amounts of forest. That's just a quirk of the way the continents are arranged. And I know you have forest in the Southern Hemisphere, but you don't get the enormous stretches of it that you get up in a place like Siberia. It's just a quirk of the way the continents happen to lie. On top of that, however, the annual cycle goes up and down, but on top of that, there's a long-term rise in carbon dioxide concentration that's gone from about 310 parts per million in 1958 up to about 410 parts per million in 2020. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it makes the atmosphere more efficient at trapping heat. Average global temperatures rise. And in case you think this is some newfangled thing that them scientists just invented because they hate jobs and prosperity and the economy, we've known about this since 1965. That's when the Presidential Scientific Advisory Board warned President Lyndon Johnson of the long-term consequences of increasing global temperatures. This isn't new. Burning fossil fuels, fossil fuels are fossils because they're made of the remains of animals and plants that lived millions of years ago, died, and then got buried and compacted into coal and oil and natural gas. So those are made of carbon that used to be part of the global carbon cycle, but has been taken out of it for many millions of years. If you burn that coal or that petroleum, you're simply taking that very old carbon that was out of circulation for a long time and putting it back into the atmosphere. Now, you do need some amount of greenhouse effect. If you didn't have any greenhouse gases, the Earth's surface would get as cold as the moon, which can get down to 153 below. So you have to have some greenhouse gases or there'd be no life. The problem is that we're already starting to see rising global temperatures, and we have for a long time, and it's starting to have noticeable effects on human life. Global warming is kind of a misnomer because global climate's a really complicated machine. And if there's more energy in the atmosphere, it can have all sorts of weird effects that are not always what you would predict. Like this is the view from my front porch back in February when we had all of that snow. That's one of those weird things that's not really supposed to happen. I prefer using the term global weirding. The effect of this warmer atmosphere is not that every place is getting always warmer all the time, but weather patterns are becoming more extreme, less predictable, and potentially more dangerous. And I will stop the recording